You don't like to talk then?
Well, not really. Sometimes if there's something to say, but there's really nothing to say these days.
In the simple story of the Beatles, everyone has their role. John was the rebel, Ringo was the heart, Paul was the charmer, and George was the quiet one, the spiritual guitarist, happy to just add his sublime licks to the Lennon-McCartney masterpieces. But that's a fairy tale. It's a neat and tidy narrative that papers over years of simmering resentment, professional frustration, and a deeply personal rivalry that festered inside George Harrison. A rivalry aimed, with surprising focus, at one man. Wasn't the press, or the fans, or the crushing weight of fame that got to him the most. It was one of his supposed brothers, the man who brought him into the band, the man he stood beside on stages across the world, and the man whose creative genius would eventually feel more like a cage. This is the story of how the quiet Beatle was pushed to his limit, and how his relationship with Paul McCartney became one of the most creatively charged and personally painful sagas in music history. For George, it was less about musical differences, and more about a fight for his own identity. The truth of this fractured brotherhood isn't found in some secret diary, but it's laid bare in the words of George himself, spoken over decades. He spent years explaining how hard it was to even get a word in edgewise. Reflecting on the dynamic, he once confessed with a mix of humor and bitterness, "You'd have to do 59 of Paul's songs before he'd even listen to one of yours. 59 to 1. It might be an exaggeration, but the feeling behind it was painfully real. It was the feeling of being constantly sidelined, of being the junior partner who was never quite taken seriously. How does a partnership that created the most beloved music in history lead to that kind of verdict? To get it, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a school bus in Liverpool, when one was the ambitious older boy, and the other was the kid brother, just happy to be there. The story of George Harrison and Paul McCartney doesn't start in a smoky club, but on a totally normal school bus in Liverpool back in 1954. Paul, a year older, and George, the younger kid, bonded over a shared obsession with skiffle and rock and roll. It was Paul who saw the raw talent in the baby-faced Harrison and pushed for him to join the band, even when John Lennon wasn't so sure. After George nailed the instrumental Raunchy on the top deck of a bus, he was in. He was a quarryman. For George, this was a dream come true. It was his ticket out of a predictable life of manual labor, a debt he knew he owed to Paul. In those early days, the hierarchy was clear without anyone needing to say it. John was the leader, the witty founder. Paul was his right-hand man, the gifted musical partner, and George Hill was the junior partner. Sure, he was the lead guitarist, but he was still the youngest, the one who'd been invited into their circle. This dynamic, forged when they were just teenagers, would cast a long shadow over their entire relationship. Paul was, in a lot of ways, an early mentor. He was the one George could learn from, the one who already had a handle on chords and song structures. They even hitchhiked to Wales together on a youthful adventure, just to learn new chords. For a while, they were best friends. When George married Pattie Boyd in 1966, right in the middle of Beatlemania, Paul was the only other Beatle who came to the wedding. He was George's best man, a symbol of a genuinely deep bond. But as the band went from local heroes to global icons, that little brother dynamic started to sour. What used to feel like mentorship now felt like control. What once sounded like guidance now sounded like condescension. George was a serious student of his craft, soaking up influences from Carl Perkins to Chet Atkins, and his guitar skills were growing by leaps and bounds. He was no longer just the kid who could play raunchy. He was developing his own melodic, intuitive, and sophisticated style. Yet within the band, he often felt his ideas were still seen through that same old lens. He was the talented junior member who needed to be told what to do. Paul, always the perfectionist and arranger, had a crystal clear vision for how a Beatles song should sound. This often meant he'd dictate bass lines, drum patterns, and most gratingly for George guitar parts. For years, George mostly went along with it, happy to serve the song as Paul and John envisioned. But a quiet frustration was taking root. He was evolving, but his role in the band felt stuck in the past. The older brother-little brother dynamic was becoming less of a supportive brotherhood and more of a creative straitjacket. The little brother was growing up, but he was still being treated like a kid, and this imbalance was about to collide with the most sacred thing in the Beatles' world, songwriting. In the universe of the Beatles, songwriting was the ultimate currency. It meant power, influence, and, of course, a ton of money. And from day one, that currency was minted by the Lennon-McCartney partnership. Their names were basically a brand, representing a bottomless well of perfect pop hits. For anyone else trying to break into that closed-off system, it was a massive challenge. For George Harrison, it was a source of long and profound frustration. Early on, it made sense. John and Paul had been writing together for years, honing a brilliant and prolific partnership. George, meanwhile, was focused on mastering the guitar. But by the mid-60s he was writing songs at first, they were just trickling in. Don't Bother Me on with the Beatles was his first to make it onto an album. But just getting his songs heard, let alone recorded, was an uphill battle against the band's built-in duopoly. This wasn't just in his head. In a 1979 interview with Rolling Stone, long after the band was over, the bitterness was still there. My problem was that it would always be very difficult to get in on the act, he explained, because Paul was very pushy in that respect. When he succumbed to playing on one of your tunes, he'd always do good, but you'd have to do 59 of Paul's songs before he'd even listen to one of yours. He felt his creative work was treated like an afterthought, a token song to keep him happy after the real business of recording. Paul and John's latest hits was done. The mid-60s were a turning point. On albums like Rubber Soul and Revolver, George's songwriting exploded. If I Needed Someone showed his mastery of folk rock, while Taxman was a blistering, cynical opener for Revolver, a song so good that Paul himself played its iconic, searing guitar solo. Love You Too was completely radical, a full dive into the Indian classical music that had captivated him, bringing the sitar and tabla to a massive pop audience. He wasn't just writing songs anymore. He was expanding what a Beatles song could even be, and yet, he was still fighting for space. Even on Revolver, he only got 3 tracks. This wasn't just about ego. It was a fundamental artistic split. Paul's songwriting, as brilliant as it was, mostly stayed in the world of Western pop, character sketches, and beautiful ballads. George, on the other hand, was on a spiritual journey. His music was becoming a way to explore Eastern philosophy and meditation. He was writing about the illusory nature of the material world on the same album that had Paul's charming ode to a meter maid, Lovely Rita. They were speaking different creative languages, and in the studio, Paul's was the default. This friction, it was made worse by Paul's style in the studio. In his mind, he was just ensuring quality control, pushing the band to get the perfect take he heard in his head. To George, it often felt patronizing. There are countless stories of Paul meticulously arranging every note, leaving little room for the intuitive playing that had defined their early sound. He'd showed George how he wanted a guitar part to be played, basically reducing a guitarist of immense skill to a session player carrying out orders. As George's then-wife, Pattie Boyd, recalled, he would come home from recording sessions furious after constant arguments. She put it bluntly, I think George basically didn't like Paul's personality. The squeeze was relentless, and George was starting to realize that the only way to breathe was to get out. The death of Brian Epstein in August 1967 wasn't just a tragedy. It was an earthquake that destabilized the entire foundation of the Beatles. Epstein was their manager, their protector, and most importantly, their diplomat. He was the buffer who could mediate the growing disputes between John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Without him, a power vacuum opened up, and Paul McCartney stepped right into it. By most accounts, Paul's intentions were good. He saw the band he loved drifting apart and losing focus. John was retreating into his world with Yoko Ono, and George was diving deeper into his spiritual life. Paul, always the workhorse, felt that if the Beatles were going to survive, someone had to take charge. He became the project manager, pushing them into ambitious new ventures. The first of these was Magical Mystery Tours, a film and EP that was largely Paul's idea to keep the band working. But what Paul saw as leadership, George saw as a hostile takeover. The collaborative spirit of their best work started to feel like a top-down company with Paul as CEO. His ideas weren't suggestions anymore, they were directives. George later said he felt like he was in a bag and they wouldn't let me out the bag, which was mainly Paul at that time. It was a feeling of being suffocated, of being creatively held down by a bandmate who couldn't see past his own vision. The recording of the White Album in 1968 laid these fractures bare. It's less a band album and more the work of 4 solo artists who happened to be sharing a studio. The tension was so thick you could cut it W. That spark came on January 10th. The cameras were rolling as Paul and George argued over the arrangement for Two of Us. The exchange is now infamous, a masterclass in passive aggression. Paul, unhappy with George's guitar fills, keeps trying to tell him what to play, to simplify it to fit his vision. George is visibly fuming. He's sick of being told what to play. After a few minutes of this condescending back and forth, the dam finally breaks. In a voice dripping with years of frustration, George says it all. I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it. It was an act of surrender, but it was also total rebellion. It was the culmination of every ignored song and every dictated guitar part. Later that day, after another clash, George had finally had enough. He calmly packed up his guitar, looked at the others, and announced, I'm leaving the band now. See you round the clubs. And he walked out. His diary entry for the day was brutally short. Got up, went to Twickenham, rehearsed until lunchtime, left the Beatles, went home. For 5 days, George Harrison wasn't a Beatle. The other three were stunned. They even talked about replacing him, maybe with Eric Clapton, but they knew it wouldn't work. The Beatles couldn't be the Beatles without all four of them. George's walkout, as brief as it was, completely shifted the power dynamic. He called their bluff. He only agreed to come back with a strict set of conditions. The awful Twickenham sessions were done. The TV special was cancelled, and they would move the project to their own, cozier Apple Studios. The others had to agree. He proved he was no longer the quiet, compliant one. He was perfectly happy to walk away from a situation that made him miserable. The day he quit, George went home and poured all his anger into a new song. He called it Wah Wah. It was a direct attack on the headache of the band's politics and the suffocating pressure he felt. He had returned to the band, but the relationship, especially with Paul, was broken beyond repair. The quiet Beatle had finally roared, and nothing would ever be the same. The truth that got George back in the door was shaky, but it lasted just long enough for the Beatles to make one last, brilliant album, Abbey Road. During those sessions, there was a new sense of professionalism, an unspoken agreement to put the drama aside and just focus on the music. For George, it was a huge moment of vindication. On an album full of some of the band's best work, his two songs, Something and Here Comes the Sun, were hailed as masterpieces. Something was praised by everyone from Frank Sinatra to John Lennon as one of the greatest songs in the entire Beatles catalog. He had finally proven, without a doubt, that he was in the same league as Lennon and McCartney. But it was too little, too late. The brotherhood was shattered. The real proof of George's creative frustration came just a year later. In 1970, with his solo album, All Things Must Pass. It was a massive, sprawling triple album, a flood of incredible songs he'd been stockpiling. For years, songs that the Beatles had overlooked or rejected. The sheer quality and quantity of the music was stunning. It was the sound of a dam breaking. The album hit #1 worldwide, and its single, My Sweet Lord, made George the first ex-Beatle to have a solo chart. He had proven, on the biggest scale imaginable, just how much talent had been sitting on the sidelines. Within this masterpiece, George also settled a few scores. The song Wah Wah was there, a sonic souvenir from the day he quit. But even more direct was the track Run of the Mill. It's a weary, sad ballad that directly addresses the breakdown of their friendships. With lyrics like, You've got me wondering how I lost your friendship, but I see it in your eyes. It reads like an open letter to Paul. In his memoir, I, Me, Mine, George confirmed the song was written when Paul was falling out with us all. His resentment didn't just show up on his own albums. He also played on one of the most vicious musical attacks in rock history, John Lennon's How Do You Sleep. The song was a brutal takedown of Paul McCartney. And laying down the slinky, venomous slide guitar was George Harrison. In the heat of the post-Beatles breakup, the battle lines were drawn. While George later expressed some regret about the track's harshness, his presence on it, at the time, sent a clear message about where his loyalties lay. Even years later, the sting was there. He'd take subtle jabs at Paul in interviews, finding it funny that after 30 years, Paul was suddenly interested in writing with him. When Paul released his 1984 film, Give My Regards to Broad Street, which featured re-recordings of Beatles songs, George joked that maybe Paul had simply run out of good ones of his own. The pain of being artistically overshadowed by Paul was a wound that never fully healed. The story of George Harrison and Paul McCartney isn't a simple case of good guys and bad guys. Hate is a strong word, and maybe it doesn't quite capture the tangled web of feelings between them. Their bond was forged in childhood, tested by fame, and fractured by ego. It was a brotherhood, capable of holding both deep love and deep resentment at the same time. A great story comes from session drummer Jim Keltner, who recalled watching John and George in the early 70s. He said they could be absolutely vicious about Paul in private, but if anyone else dared to say a bad word about him, they would immediately jump to his defense. He was their brother to criticize, nobody else's. That paradox is the core of their story. Through the 70s and 80s, their friendship was distant. They reunited for the Beatles anthology project in the mid-90s, but even then, people who were there noted a definite tension between them. It was only in the final years of George's life, as he faced his own mortality, that a real peace was found. Paul would visit George, and the old grudges seemed to melt away. Paul recalled one of their last meetings, just before George passed away in 2001. We held hands. Paul said, It's funny, even at the height of our friendship, as guys, you would never hold hands, ... but it was lovely. In that simple gesture, decades of resentment, of feeling overlooked, seemed to dissolve. At the end, Paul called him his little baby brother, a nickname that once symbolized a frustrating hierarchy, but was now purely an expression of lifelong affection. The story of George and Paul is a powerful reminder that even in a partnership, that changed the world. Human emotions, pride, frustration, and the need for respect are always part of the picture. The quiet Beatle may have carried a deep and lasting resentment, but his story is also one of eventual peace. So what do you think? Was this a case of genuine animosity, or the painful, complicated story of a brotherhood that was pushed to its absolute limit? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into music history.